Welcome, friends, to Sci-Fi Travelers. I'm here with a very enjoyable story. In this episode, I will tell you the story of Theodore, a human, and Emma, an alien woman, a love story that transcends galaxies. If you're ready, let's begin. Out of excitement, I said, "Your lips are so pretty." And the alien woman smiled and said, "You can kiss me if you want." The star had been dying for 3 months, which was, by the standards of stars, the astronomical equivalent of a man clearing his throat before a toast and then forgetting what he wanted to say. Theodore had watched it clear its throat 41 times now. He'd started keeping a tally on the inside of his locker door, 1 scratch per false alarm, and the marks had begun to look less like a countdown and more like the diary of a prisoner who suspected he'd been forgotten. The research station Meridian hung in a lazy orbit around the thing. A cramped tin can of a facility bolted together by people who had clearly prioritized the telescopes over the plumbing. There were 9 humans aboard. 4 Cyrelli, 1 indeterminate contractor named Pell who claimed to be from a moon nobody could pronounce, and a coffee machine that produced a brown liquid the crew referred to, generously, as coffee. Theodore had lodged 3 formal complaints about the coffee. All 3 had been filed, he was fairly sure, directly into the vacuum of space. The star itself was a red supergiant the color of a bruise going yellow, vast enough that if you set it where the sun should be, it would have swallowed the orbit of Mars and asked for seconds. It was supposed to collapse. Everyone agreed it was supposed to collapse. The models agreed, the instruments agreed, the 6 separate universities funding the mission agreed, and the star, sovereign and enormous and answerable to no grant committee, continued to sit there and think about it. "It's stage fright," Theodore said, not for the first time, leaning against the rail of the observation balcony with a mug of the brown liquid cooling in his hands. "Biggest audience of its life. Can't blame it for freezing." "Stars do not experience stage fright," said Emma, without looking up from her console. "They experience gravitational collapse. The two are not related, though I understand the confusion given how much of your species' behavior appears to be one masquerading as the other." This was the sort of thing Emma said. She said it in the same tone a person might use to read out a shopping list, which was what made it lethal. Theodore had spent his first week aboard mistaking her for humorless, and the entire remainder of his time aboard correcting that error, one small ambush at a time. She was Cyrelli, which meant she was the deep, unbothered blue of a deep, unbothered ocean, and that her ears swept back and up into long, tapered points that caught the light when she leaned toward a readout. Beyond that, she was, unnervingly, just a person. 2 eyes, 1 nose, an expression that gave away exactly as much as she decided it would, and not 1 degree more. When Theodore had first arrived, he'd expected the alienness to sit somewhere obvious, in the skin or the ears, and instead had found it hiding in smaller places, in the way she went utterly still before she said something devastating, in the fact that she found human idioms delightful and collected them the way other people collected stamps. She had once described a difficult calibration as a real dog's breakfast, with the quiet pride of a woman deploying a weapon she'd been saving. He was, and he would have denied this under any interrogation short of the airlock, arranging his shifts to overlap with hers. He told himself it was professional. She was the best spectroscopist on the station, possibly the best he'd ever worked beside. And when the star finally did decide to perform, he wanted the sharpest eyes in the room next to his. This was true. It was so comfortably true that he could hide the other reasons behind it, the way you might park a large truck in front of a house you didn't want anyone looking at. 41, he said, gesturing at the star with his mug. 41 times it's gotten our hopes up. At this point, I'm emotionally invested in it never dying. I've grown attached. We've been through so much together. You have been through nothing together. You have watched it. That is the entire relationship. That's most of my relationships, honestly. Emma's mouth did the thing it did. Not a smile. She would never have permitted anything so unguarded. But a small tension at one corner. The ghost of a smile filed away for later. Evidence she refused to release. Theodore counted it as a victory anyway. He had, at some point in the last few weeks, begun to keep a second private tally that had nothing to do with the star, and this one he did not scratch into any locker door, Because there are some things a man does not want the historical record to contain. Get some rest, she said. You have been on this balcony for 11 hours. The star will still be undecided in the morning. You say that every night. And I have been correct every night. She rose, unhurried, gathering the data slate under one arm. Statistically, you should find that reassuring. He watched her go, which he also would have denied. It was 4:12 station time, and he had actually turned toward the corridor and the promise of his narrow bunk, when the console behind him made a sound he had never once heard it make in 3 months. It was not an alarm. Alarms he knew. This was smaller and worse. A single soft chime, almost polite, the sound of an instrument noticing something it had genuinely not expected to notice. Theodore turned back. On the readout, in the column that had sat flat and sullen for 41 false alarms, a number had begun, very quietly, to climb. The number climbed for 6 glorious minutes, and then it stopped, sat there smugly for a while like a cat that had knocked something off a table, and slid back down to where it had been. 42. Theodore added the scratch to his locker door at 04:31 with the weary devotion of a monk illuminating a manuscript nobody would ever read, and went to bed and dreamed about nothing, which was a mercy. Life on the meridian resumed its shape. The thing about waiting for a star to die is that it is, minute to minute, indistinguishable from waiting for nothing at all, and so the crew filled the waiting the way crews always have, with routine, with grievance, with the small theater of 13 people and one unpronounceable contractor pretending the walls weren't very close together. There was a rota for the good telescope. There was a long-standing Cold War over the thermostat. There was the coffee, eternal and unforgivable. And there was Emma, 3 shifts a week, sometimes 4 when Theodore got creative with the scheduling software. He learned her in pieces, the way you learn anything worth learning, which is to say slowly and mostly by accident. He learned that she took her notes in a Cyrelli shorthand so dense it looked like a spider had fallen in the ink, and that she was quietly, ferociously competitive about calibration times, and that she considered human music structurally alarming, but emotionally efficient. He learned that when she was concentrating, she went so completely motionless that he'd once genuinely checked whether she was breathing, and she'd said, without moving, "I am. Thank you for your concern. Please stop looming." He learned, too, the thing that would matter later, though he didn't know it was going to matter, which is how the important things usually arrive, disguised as small talk. They'd been recalibrating the spectrometer, which involved a fluid coolant that was, Theodore had been assured, entirely safe and only mildly corrosive, a combination of adjectives that had never once reassured anybody. The station's gravity generator chose that moment to hiccup. It did this roughly weekly, a stuttering half-second of freefall that the engineers kept promising to fix and never did. And in that half-second, a full canister of the mildly corrosive coolant left Theodore's hands, became a slow, beautiful sphere of drifting silver, and then, as gravity sheepishly returned, came down across both of them like a benediction nobody had asked for. Emma said a word. Theodore didn't know the word. It was Cyrelli, and it was long, and it had a great many consonants in it that seemed to be fighting each other, and she delivered it with a fluency and a venom that told him everything he needed to know about its meaning without a single syllable being translated. "I'm going to need that on a plaque," he said, dripping. "You are going to need a shower," she said. "We both are. That fluid is only safe for approximately 4 minutes." She was already moving. "This is a poor time to discover you find something funny." "It's a great time. It might be the last time." 4 minutes, you said." They made it, obviously, with a minute and change to spare, and afterward, damp and singed smelling and slightly giddy on the far side of a near miss, they sat in the galley and she taught him the word. She would not tell him what it meant precisely. "It does not translate," she said. "It is what you say when the universe has been petty. English does not have a word for that specific pettiness. Your species experiences it constantly and has, inexplicably, never named it." It was there, somewhere in the warm wreckage of that evening, that he asked her the thing. He'd noticed it for a while, that the Cyrelli aboard were unfailingly kind and unfailingly formal, that they never quite said the soft thing outright, that affection among them seemed to move underwater, felt more than spoken. He'd assumed it was reserve. He asked her about it the way you ask about the weather, not knowing you're standing at the edge of something. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "For us, to speak of feeling is not a small thing. Among your people, a person may say, 'I adore you' to a sandwich. Yes, it costs nothing, so it means nothing, and everyone understands the exchange rate." She turned her mug slowly on the table. For a Cyrelli, to say the tender thing aloud is to commit to it. It is a door that only opens one direction. So we do not say it lightly, and we do not say it first, not until we are certain the other has already arrived at the same place, because to say it first, unanswered, is... She searched, found the human phrase, and offered it almost gently. A dog's breakfast. Of the heart. He laughed, because she'd wanted him to, because she'd built the joke specifically so the moment wouldn't have to be as heavy as it was. He understood that much. He filed the rest of it somewhere he wasn't looking. "So you just wait," he said. "However long, for the other person to say it first." "Yes, that's either the most patient thing I've ever heard, or the most stubborn." "They are," said Emma, "frequently the same thing." And she looked at him then in a way that lasted a half-second too long, and Theodore felt the whole warm evening tilt toward something, felt a sentence rise up in his chest, fully formed and terrifying, felt his mouth actually open. And then he said, "We should check the coolant seals," and stood up too fast, and the moment closed like water over a dropped stone. Emma looked at him a beat longer. "Yes," she said evenly, "we should." But she'd seen it. He knew she'd seen it. She saw everything. It started, as these things do, with the coffee machine. At 9:40 the next morning, the brown liquid dispenser emitted a sound like a man being surprised in a lift, went dark, and refused all further conversation, and the crew reacted to this the way people react to the death of a beloved pet they'd always publicly claimed to hate. There was mourning. There was blame. Pell delivered a short eulogy. And it was only because half the station had crowded into the galley to argue about it that everyone was in the same place when the real alarm went off. The loud one, the ugly one, the one Theodore actually knew. The star had stopped clearing its throat. He was on the balcony in 90 seconds, still holding, absurdly, a mug of nothing. Emma was already there, and one look at her face told him this was not 43. The number that had climbed for 6 minutes yesterday and slunk back down was climbing again, and this time it was not slinking anywhere. It was going up the way water goes down, with the total unbothered confidence of a thing that has finally remembered what it is. "Core temperature," Emma said, not looking away from the readout. "It has crossed the threshold. Iron in the core. It cannot fuse iron. There is nothing left to hold it up." "How long?" "Hours. Perhaps less." Her voice was perfectly level, which was how he knew to be frightened. "Theodore, the shielding. The shielding was the problem, and it became the entire problem with breathtaking speed. A star does not die politely. It dies in a scream of radiation across every wavelength at once, and the Meridian had been built to observe that scream from what everyone had assured 6 separate grant committees was a safe distance. But safe had been calculated for a clean collapse, and this star, contrary to the last, was doing the thing stars occasionally do, which is to shed a preliminary shell of gas in a great asymmetric belch. A belch now drifting between the station and the star and lensing the radiation in ways nobody's model had troubled to predict. "The starboard array is going to take the brunt," Theodore said, reading it off, feeling the arithmetic go cold in his stomach. "That's, Emma, that's the whole crew habitat behind that array. If the shielding on the starboard side isn't reinforced before the flux peaks, then it will be a very well-documented death," said Emma. "The instruments will survive us. Small comfort. Move." What followed was 2 hours Theodore would never be able to describe properly afterward. because terror and competence blur together into something that has no good name. They rerouted power. They rotated the station on its lazy axis to put the reinforced dorsal shielding toward the star, a maneuver the Meridian had absolutely not been designed to perform quickly, and which it performed now with the enthusiasm of a cruise ship attempting ballet. They worked side by side at the same console, and in the crush of it all their usual careful politeness simply fell away, because there was no time to be polite, only time to be true. Left, left, the coupling's on the left. I have eyes, Theodore. You have two. I'm helping. You are narrating. I narrate when I'm scared. It's a documented. The station lurched. An alarm changed pitch. It's a documented condition. My mother did it too. Your mother is not currently piloting a research station. No, she'd be much calmer, frankly. She once landed a shuttle in a hailstorm and complained the whole time about the "got it, that's got it, the coupling's live." And it held. The number that had been climbing toward a threshold marked, in the cheerful red of engineers who never expect to see it lit, catastrophic, slowed, stuttered, and settled just beneath it. The dorsal shielding sang with absorbed radiation and did not fail. In the galley, Pell reported later, 3 people had been holding hands with a contractor they'd met that morning, and nobody had been embarrassed about it afterward, which was how you knew it had been genuinely bad. Theodore realized he was gripping the edge of the console hard enough to hurt. He realized Emma's hand was next to his, and had been for some time, close enough that their smallest fingers were nearly touching, and that neither of them had moved it away. "We're alive," he said stupidly. "For now," she agreed. "You are welcome to find that funny. Give me a minute. I'll get there." She almost smiled. She actually almost smiled, the whole thing, unfiled, and then she caught it and put it away, and turned back to the readout, and went very still in the particular way that meant something worse or something wonderful. "Theodore." Her voice had changed. "Come and look." He looked. The number was climbing again, but slowly now, differently, a long, clean curve toward a peak the models agreed on this time. Not the ragged spike of the belch. The real thing. The collapse proper. "It's going to go," she said quietly. "Not in days. Not in a false alarm. Tonight." She turned to him, sapphire and long-eared and lit blue-white by the readout, and there was something in her face he'd never catalogued before. "After 3 months. It waited for us to nearly die first. That is either very poetic or very rude." "Both," Theodore said. "They're frequently the same thing." And she looked at him, and the whole balcony went quiet around them, and the dying star gathered itself in the great window to finally, at long last, make its speech. The crew gathered on the balcony as the hour came, all 13 of them and the contractor, because there are some things you do not watch alone even if you have to stand shoulder to shoulder with people you've been feuding with about a thermostat for 3 months. Someone had, against all regulations and all common sense, produced a bottle of something amber and illegal, and it went around the room in defiance of the fact that most of them were technically on duty. Nobody said anything. The star was about to die. Rank felt small. Theodore ended up at the far end of the great window, slightly apart, and Emma was beside him, which was not an accident on his part, and he was beginning to suspect, not an accident on hers. Then the star let go. He would spend the rest of his life failing to describe it. The core fell inward faster than thought, faster than the word for fast, matter crushing matter until it could not be crushed further, and then rebounding in a shock wave that tore the outer star apart from the inside. Light came off it in a wall. Not a glow, a wall, a bloom of violence so bright the window darkened itself in tears to keep from blinding them, and even dimmed. It was the most light Theodore had ever seen in one place, blue-white shading to a savage gold, expanding, unfurling, a flower the size of a solar system opening in total silence, because space is merciful enough not to make you hear these things. Somebody was crying. Somebody else was laughing. Pell said very softly, "Oh," which was the most eloquent thing anyone managed. And the light reached them, and it broke across the balcony, and it broke across Emma. It scattered over her the way light scatters through water, the way it scatters through anything blue and clear and deep, and her sapphire skin caught it and threw it back, so that for a moment she wasn't lit by the star, she was made of it, a woman assembled out of the last breath of something enormous, her long ears edged in gold, her still face turned up to a spectacle that had taken 3 months and nearly all their lives to arrive. Theodore had come to the meridian to watch a star die. He had not, at any point, been warned that the star would be the second most beautiful thing in the room. He was dazzled. He was unguarded. He was somewhere outside the part of himself that keeps a hand on the wheel, and the sentence that had been rising in his chest for weeks, the one he'd swallowed in the galley, the one he'd traded for a comment about coolant seals, chose that exact undefended moment to arrive at his mouth without stopping at his judgment on the way. "Your lips are so pretty," he said. The words went out into the humming quiet and hung there. For 1 full second, Theodore experienced time the way the star had, everything crushing inward at once. Some functioning corner of his brain, arriving late and appalled, began to catalog his options. He could claim the light had affected him. He could pretend he'd been talking about the star. He could, ideally, walk directly through the reinforced window and take his chances with the supernova, which suddenly seemed like the more survivable of the situations available to him. He'd said it. He'd actually said it out loud, to a colleague, to Emma, while she stood there, being made of starlight, and now she was going to turn to him with that carefully governed face, and he was going to watch her decide, in real time, how to be gentle about a thing he could never take back. Emma turned from the window, and her face was not governed. That was the first thing he understood, before anything else, before the words, that the careful, filed-away, half-second and no more expression she'd worn for 3 months was simply gone, and underneath it was something open and unhidden and almost frightened, the face of a person who has been holding very still for a very long time, and has just felt permission arrive. "You can kiss me if you want," she said. And then he understood the rest of it, all at once, the way the star had understood what it was. We do not say it first. He'd thought she meant it as a custom, a quaint formality, a thing that happened to other Cyrelli in some abstract elsewhere. He had not understood that she'd been standing inside it this whole time. That every half-smile she'd caught and put away, every look that lasted a beat too long, every shift she'd let him rearrange without once mentioning that she'd noticed, all of it had been Emma waiting, unable to reach for the thing herself, forbidden by everything she was from opening the door, needing him to be the one to say the tender thing out loud so that she'd finally be allowed to answer. She hadn't been reserved. She'd been patient, and he'd nearly, out of his own cowardice, made her wait forever. "You've been waiting," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," said Emma. "You are, if it is any comfort, extraordinarily slow. I nearly told you the coolant word again out of frustration. I thought that word was for when the universe is petty." "It is also," she said, "for you specifically." And Theodore laughed helplessly, because she'd built the joke again, the same as she always did. A small door held open so the moment wouldn't have to carry more weight than 2 people could lift at once, and then he stopped laughing, and he crossed the small distance that had taken 3 months and a dying star to close, and he kissed her. Behind them, the supernova burned on, indifferent and immense, flooding the balcony with the light of something ending, while in front of it 2 people who had never dared reach for each other finally, quietly, did. The crew, to their eternal credit, pretended very hard to be looking at the star. The crew did not, in fact, pretend for very long. By breakfast the next morning, a subdued affair, the coffee machine still dead, the star now a spreading bruise of glowing gas where a giant used to be, it was clear that every single person aboard the Meridian had seen exactly what they'd seen, and had elected, as one body, to be insufferable about it. Nobody said anything directly. That would have been too easy, too clean. Instead, there was a new and terrible atmosphere of goodwill. People smiled at Theodore. People he'd never spoken to smiled at Theodore. Pell, passing him in the corridor, said only, "Nice night," with the grave sincerity of a man commenting on the weather, and Theodore had to go and stand in a supply closet for a moment to collect himself. "They're being kind," Emma observed. watching a junior technician quietly relocate her own breakfast tray so that the two of them could sit together without having to negotiate for it. It is worse than cruelty. Cruelty I could return. "This is a small station," Theodore said. "We watched a star die together, and then I made a fool of myself in front of the entire crew. We're basically a documentary now. They're going to be talking about this at 3 different universities." "You did not make a fool of yourself." She considered this. "You made a late fool of yourself. There is a difference. The foolishness was always going to happen. You simply scheduled it poorly, as is your habit. It was good." That was the thing he kept coming back to over the next few days, in the stolen minutes between processing the flood of supernova data that had every scientist aboard working double shifts. It was good, easily, unreasonably good, the way a thing is when it has been true underneath for a long time and finally gets to be true on the surface. They still argued about calibration. She still went motionless and lethal before saying something that dismantled him. Nothing essential had changed except that now, when the look lasted a beat too long, neither of them had to pretend it hadn't. Which was exactly why the message, when it came, landed the way it did. It arrived through the official channel, addressed to the whole station, and Theodore read it standing up and then had to sit down. The star was dead. The Meridian's mission had been, specifically and only, to observe its death. That had always been the deal. Nobody builds a permanent home around a supernova, but somehow in 3 months of waiting for the thing to happen, Theodore had let himself forget that after it happened, there would be an after. The station was to be decommissioned, the crew reassigned. Transport was already being arranged. He found the relevant lines twice before he made himself believe them. The Cyrelli personnel were to be routed back through Cyrelli space, to a deep field posting near their own worlds. The human personnel were to be routed the other way entirely, back toward the human core. Not adjacent, not nearby. Opposite directions across a vastness that the word impractical did not begin to cover. The kind of distance that isn't a distance so much as a decision. A gap you don't cross casually or cheaply or, realistically, more than a very small number of times in one life. He found Emma in the spectrometry lab. She had already read it. He could tell from the stillness, not her ordinary stillness, the good kind, the concentrating kind, but a new one, a braced one. "You've seen it," he said. "Yes." "Emma, it is a good posting," she said evenly to the readout. "The deep field work near home is significant. I would have applied for it a year ago. It is exactly the kind of thing I came out here hoping to earn." "That's not." He stopped, started again. "You're doing the thing, where you tell me the facts very calmly so we don't have to talk about the other thing." "Yes," said Emma. "I find it works. Please do not interfere with it. He gestured uselessly at the whole of the last few days, at the balcony, at the star, at everything. We waited 3 months. You waited 3 months. And now the universe's plan is, what? We get a week?" And here she turned, and the calm cracked, just slightly, just enough. And what was underneath it wasn't anger, though it came out shaped like anger, because fear so often borrows anger's clothes when it has nothing else to wear. "What would you have me do, Theodore? Refuse the posting? Follow you to the human core, where I would be the only Cyrelli within 1,000 light years and a curiosity in every room I entered? Or shall I ask you to come to mine, and be the curiosity yourself, and give up your work, so that we might be together and quietly resent the choice for the rest of our lives?" Her voice didn't rise. It got quieter, which was worse. "I have thought about this more than you have. I have had to. My people do not open this door lightly, you know this, and I opened it knowing what was on the other side of it. Knowing the mission would end. I decided you were worth the dog's breakfast. Do not make me regret being brave about it." The lab hummed around them. Somewhere down the corridor, someone laughed at something, unaware. "I'm not going to lose you to a logistics decision," Theodore said. "I nearly lost you to my own cowardice already. I'm not doing it twice, and I'm definitely not doing it to a transport schedule." He was already somewhere underneath the fear, beginning to think, because that was the thing about nearly dying next to someone at a console. You learned exactly how good the two of you were when there was a problem in front of you. And this was a problem. It was just a problem that hadn't yet been made to hold still long enough to solve. How long until the transports arrive? Emma looked at him wary, the scientist in her recognizing the shift in him. 11 days. Why? Because, said Theodore, we've got a supernova's worth of fresh data, the two most qualified people in known space to interpret it. And 11 days. That's not an ending. That's a deadline. He stood. And I do some of my best work against a deadline. Ask the star. The thing about a supernova is that it does not, contrary to every dramatic instinct, simply end. What it leaves behind is a remnant, a vast, expanding, completely gorgeous shell of glowing gas, seeded with every heavy element the star forged in its long dying. The raw material of future planets and future people, all of it lit from within by the collapsed heart the star left at its center. It is, scientifically speaking, one of the richest objects in the universe to study. Nobody had ever studied one this fresh. The meridian had been sitting, this whole time, on the front row of a phenomenon that would take not weeks, but years to properly understand. Theodore stopped sleeping. Emma, who did not require sleep on the human schedule and had always privately considered his need for it a design flaw, stopped pretending to. They built the proposal together over 9 of their 11 days, at the same console where they'd nearly died, fueled by the resurrected coffee machine, which Pell, in a burst of engineering born of the general station-wide investment in Theodore's love life, had fixed on day 3, presenting the first fresh cup to Theodore with the words, "For morale," and a look that made Theodore have to visit the supply closet again. The argument the proposal made was simple, and, once Emma had sharpened it, unanswerable. The remnant demanded a permanent research posting. That posting demanded a spectroscopist and an astronomer who had witnessed the collapse itself, who understood the instruments, who possessed a continuity of data no fresh crew could replicate. There were, in all of known space, exactly 2 people who fit that description. It would be, Emma noted dryly, an act of institutional negligence to root them in opposite directions. "We're not asking them to do us a favor," Theodore said, reading the final draft. "We're pointing out that separating us would be bad science." "Yes," said Emma. "It is important that they never learn we would have solved this problem regardless. Let them believe it was their idea. Bureaucracies, like stars, prefer to think they arrived at their collapse independently. They submitted it to all 6 universities at once, which was either a masterstroke or a violation of about 4 protocols, and then they waited. And Theodore discovered that waiting for a committee is materially worse than waiting for a star, because at least the star had never had the option of saying no. The answer came on the 10th day. He made Emma read it because his hands were doing something undignified. She read it. She went utterly, completely still, the concentrating stillness, the good one. And then she did something he had waited 3 months and changed to see and had honestly begun to think he never would. She smiled. The whole thing. Unfiled, unhidden, released at last into the world where he could see it. And it was, he thought, easily brighter than the supernova and considerably better aimed. "Approved," she said. "Joint posting. Indefinite. The meridian is to be redesignated a permanent remnant research station." She set the slate down with great care as though it might detonate. "We are apparently indispensable. I intend to be insufferable about this for some time." "You're allowed," Theodore said. "You waited long enough for something to be insufferable about." And there it was, the thing he'd actually learned out here watching a star take 3 months to say what it had to say. He'd come aboard the Meridian a man who parked large trucks in front of houses he didn't want examined, who traded true sentences for comments about coolant seals, who could stand beside the best thing in his life for weeks and call it scheduling. He'd thought the bravery was in the grand gesture, the words at the window. It wasn't. The words had fallen out of him by accident, dazzled and unguarded. Any coward could be brave once, by surprise. The real thing was harder and quieter and came after. The 11 days of refusing to let the universe file him and Emma into separate drawers. The choosing, over and over, of a difficult true thing over an easy silent one. Emma had opened her door knowing exactly what waited on the other side. He'd spent his whole life keeping his shut. She had, without ever quite saying so, taught him how to leave it open. The crew departed on schedule, the humans one way and the Cyrelli the other, and every one of them found some excuse to say goodbye to the two who were staying. Pell shook Theodore's hand for an uncomfortably long time and said, "Nice night," one final time, and Theodore, at last, laughed instead of fleeing. Then the station was quiet, and it was theirs, and the remnant burned in the great window. No longer a wall of violence, but a slow, unfurling ghost of light, green and gold, and impossibly blue at its edges. The corpse of the giant become the most beautiful thing either of them had ever been paid to look at. They stood at the window together, where it had all happened, where he'd said the accidental true thing and she'd finally been allowed to answer. And Emma turned to him, not lit by the star this time, but simply herself, sapphire and long-eared and entirely without her careful governing face, because she had stopped needing it around him some days ago and had not bothered to put it back on. "Theodore," she said quietly, "I love you." He understood what it cost. He understood that among her people the door opened one direction, that she did not say the tender thing lightly or first, and that she had, at long last, been given a place solid enough to stand on to say it before he did, that this was the whole of what she'd been waiting 3 months and a dying star to be able to do. "I know," he said, and grinned, and pulled her in. "You're extraordinarily slow, has anyone told you?" "Once," said Emma against his shoulder. It took. And behind them, the dead star burned on, patient and immense, no longer indifferent at all, casting its long, gentle light across the two people who would spend the rest of their lives learning to read it, and who had already, between them, worked out the only part that mattered. Some doors only open one way. Theodore spent his whole life keeping his shut, trading true things for safe ones, calling the best moments of his days mere scheduling, standing beside what he wanted and naming it something smaller. It took a dying star, a near catastrophe, and a woman who had already been brave to teach him that the words at the window were never the hard part. Anyone can be brave once, by accident. The real courage came after, in the choosing, again and again, of a difficult truth over an easy silence. And Emma had been waiting the whole time, not reserved, not distant, just patient, holding still, unable to reach first, needing him to open a door she couldn't. How much of what we mistake for someone's coldness is only someone waiting for us to be brave enough to speak? So let me leave you with this. Who is standing beside you right now made of ordinary light that you keep calling something smaller than they are? What true sentence have you swallowed, traded away for a comment about coolant seals because saying it out loud felt like a door you couldn't take back? The star waited 3 months to say what it had to say. Theodore nearly waited forever. You don't have to. The end. Friends, we've reached the end of Theodore and Emma's story. I hope you enjoyed it. Before we go, I have a request. Please don't forget to hit the like button below and leave your thoughts on the story in the comments. Subscribe to Sci-Fi Traveler so you don't miss the next story. See you very soon in a new story. Goodbye.